Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We'll just give 1 minute or so for folks to trickle in, but welcome to our Future of Data Centers webinar. Thank you again for being here today. While folks trickle in, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Ria Perot. I'm a manager at MaRS Discovery District, and I lead the Mission for MaRS Better Buildings program. I will be your MC for today's webinar, focused on the future of data centers in the GTHA. I think that folks are still trickling in, so we'll just give 1 minute or so, but we'll jump into it pretty quickly. For your awareness, this webinar is being recorded. Live transcription is available at the bottom of the screen if you need it, and you can message the hosts and panelists via the chat function. And this recording will be available on the Mission from MaRS website later on. So thank you again for joining. I think we're at 12:01, and as I mentioned, we have lots to cover. So let's get started. Just a quick agenda for today. We have a very short introduction. I'm going to keep it as brief as possible about MaRS and our project partners Mantle and the project itself. The meat and potatoes, of course, is the presentation on the outcomes of the report and the work on the future of data centers in the GTHA. And we have a very exciting fireside chat to dig deeper into some of the key messages and really the nuances of what we talk about in the report. There's lots of detail in there, so we are going to put a link in the chat for you to dig into our findings after today's webinar. It's a very exciting topic. It's a timely topic, the future of data centers in the GTHA. There's, with the growth of AI, there's so much growing public awareness that we're seeing and interest in the physical infrastructure that is needed to support this AI growth, which of course is data centers. And I think that's a really good reminder that this digital world that we're increasingly living in, these virtual events and chatbots that we're talking to, this is all rooted in real places, right? So data centers are just one of the newest in a long line of physical infrastructure, buildings, other forms of development that are enabling these new ways of life by actually shaping physical places that humans and nature have inhabited and impacting the communities that were there before. So while this is a virtual event, I just want to ground that in the fact that we're talking about real infrastructure, real places, real impacts. So prior to the conversation, I wish to acknowledge that MaRS is based in Toronto. That's also where I'm calling in from as well. Toronto is the ancestral and present-day homelands and waterways of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. And the Métis people of Toronto and York regions have also settled their communities here. In the report, we are looking at the GTHA, including present-day Hamilton, which is also the traditional territory of the Erie. So wherever you're listening in from, we thank you for joining us and encourage you to learn a little more about the land that you're calling in from. And there's some resources to do that in the chat. MaRS, if you haven't heard of us, is North America's largest urban innovation hub. We act as an ecosystem convener in virtual spaces such as these ones and in our physical ones. There's a picture of the MaRS Center in downtown Toronto from a nice bird's eye view on your screen at the moment. In addition to that physical space, that we support over 1,200 Canadian technology companies with tailored services and programs to help them kind of on their pathway to commercialization. And we aim to give Canadian technology a voice in topical conversations such as these. We also run programs to bridge the gap between innovation and the market and support industry actors in leveraging Canadian technology to achieve their targets. Mission from MaRS is one such program that hones in on supporting the adoption of Canadian clean tech in high impact sectors. We currently have 4 missions, including Better Buildings, which is the mission that I lead. And the key objectives you can see kind of on the screen, but just to give you a sense, we're looking at innovation adoption to reduce both the operational and embodied carbon of buildings. So that's everything from single family homes to data centers, of course. And then thirdly is amplifying the role of Canadian clean tech to create a lower carbon and more resilient built environment. And that's really where a lot of this work fits in. In terms of why we are looking at data centers through our Better Buildings mission. Of course, as an innovation hub in 2026, the growth of AI is of great interest to us. But in addition to that, we know that data centers are kind of one of the most energy intensive forms of building and development out there. right? So looking at the projected demand for AI growth, we know that we're facing a massive challenge, but also a critical opportunity. And that's really what we wanted to look at through this work. Can we really ride this wave of infrastructure investment to build resilience and build sustainability into our energy system? So instead of having like ad hoc isolated projects that could complicate our grid planning at a time that we're already trying to go cleaner and trying to electrify, we're advocating instead for coordinated and co-located hubs, and we'll get a lot more into this in just a few minutes. But in terms of other reasons that we wanted to look into this, of course, the climate impact. The growing need and demand for data centers will challenge our climate goals, especially given other local challenges around electrification and decarbonization of the built environment. There are innovative technologies and innovative approaches like waste heat recovery, demand response that could be leveraged in the coming years to ensure that data centers are not a strain on the system forever. And then finally, domestic capacity. Data centers go beyond the sort of tech infrastructure to actually part of our sovereign economic infrastructure. And building AI compute here in Ontario means defending Ontario's competitiveness and maintaining our scientific leadership. So by bringing together a cross-sector of industry stakeholders in digital infrastructure, construction, energy, policymakers, regulators, innovators, all these different groups of relevant community stakeholders. Through this project, we sought to quantify the local and systems level impacts of data center expansion in terms of power, energy emissions, and exploring potential pathways to reduce those impacts. I want to, of course, acknowledge the people and organizations that made this possible. First of all, very, very generous support from TAF, the Atmospheric Fund, as well as our advisory committee members, Enbridge, the IESO, OPG, Hydro One, and Toronto Hydro. We wish to extend our heartfelt gratitude to each of those organizations, as well as the 35 plus organizations and over 50 people that lent their time and their expertise and spent all day with us at the MaRS Center for over three workshops over the course of 2025. Many of those folks are in the audience today. We're very grateful for that, and also very grateful for the incredible project team. We did this in partnership with Mantle Climate, and the work outcomes and really the project itself would not have been possible without them. So it's my pleasure to put a face to some of the names in the report. I want to give a big thanks to Kathleen Kauth, Irene Lamb, Josh Mogul, and Megan Johnson from the Mantle team, as well as Tyler Hamilton and Olivia Lang from MaRS. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Irene to introduce Mantle and the rest of the presentations. Over to you, Irene.
Great. Thanks, Ria. Our team's so excited to be here, so thanks again for putting this together. For those who do not know Mantle, Mantle Climate is a Toronto-based climate strategy and risk management firm. We are very focused on the built environment. We work across real estate developers, investors, operators, and government to design and build more sustainably. And of course, one of the largest growing segments of real estate that we work with is data centers. As part of that work, we noticed that there was a gap in the types of conversations we were having for and with a Canadian audience. So as a former Martian myself, it's been a pleasure working with MaRS and the MFM team again on this initiative to bring together the digital infrastructure and energy sectors to tackle some of the things that Ria mentioned at the top, to break down the silos and identify opportunities for both innovation and climate leadership in a Canadian context. For those that don't know me, my name is Irene, and I'm a director at Mantle, working closely with our data center clients and projects, including this collaboration with MaRS. So I will take you through the fireside chat in just a moment. But until then, I know we have a lot to get through, so I'm going to pass the floor to Josh to cover off some of the project highlights to start.
Okay, thank you very much, Irene. Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Mogul. I'm a senior advisor at Mantle Climate. And before we have a slightly larger conversation around the implications of our report, I'd love to just take you through some of the highlights of our findings. Now, we've said it before, we're going to say it again. Why are we looking at data centers? Why are they so important? Well, really, they're one of the largest disruptors of our electricity grids in a generation. They're coming online at a time where we're looking to electrify a lot of other sectors too. We're looking at industry, transportation, heating. All of these new loads are coming online at the same time. So data center growth, on top of everything else, is just introducing a new category of electricity demand, really. requiring decisions about which large loads to prioritize and under what conditions. So managing the impacts of this data center expansion is critical. It's going to shape a lot of things: economic outcomes, system reliability, greenhouse gas emissions trajectories for the province as a whole, and of course, affordability for ratepayers. But if we can manage these impacts, we are set to gain a whole lot. An increasing number of experts agree that sovereign compute is likely going to be critical for the future of our economy. Now, our report set out a few key objectives to help frame the narrative and encourage productive conversations. I want to flag now that what we've produced is not in any way a prediction. The goal is really to put forward what we believe, along with experts in the field, to be reasonable numbers so that people can react to them and we can have an interesting conversation about how to mitigate some of the impacts of this data center build out. So we're looking first off to determine estimates again of economically competitive compute growth in Ontario over the next decade. We want to quantify the local and system level power, energy, and emissions impacts from this growth, explore innovative solutions to try and reduce impacts where possible, and facilitate collaboration between energy and digital infrastructure industries. Now, the way we decided to go about framing this whole conversation is broken down into three key metrics. One being total energy consumption. We're looking specifically at electricity in this case. We're also looking at coincident peak load, which is a little separate from total energy consumption because at certain times of the day and certain times of the year, you can have much higher power demands, and those need to be reflected in any modeling that you do. And finally, total greenhouse gas emissions. So, to highlight the potential impacts of data center growth and the limitations of any mitigation solutions that we might enact, we decided to look at two hypothetical growth scenarios. The first one looks at 1.5 gigawatts of new data center capacity being added in Ontario by 2035. And the second looks at doubling that. So what would happen if 3 gigawatts of new data centers came online by 2035? In both of these cases, we assumed that most data center growth would occur in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. This is where most of the users of the compute will be, and so data centers do tend to like to be as close as they can to those users to reduce latency and other things. We also looked at a smaller amount of data center growth scattered throughout the province. So for 1.5 gigawatts, according to current planning being done by the IESO, grid expansions that are already in the works now are largely able to accommodate this data center growth. We've been looking at data centers, we know they're coming, and so they're already incorporated into our modeling to this extent. So for 1.5 gigawatts, our scenario really looks at what we can do to minimize the impacts of this build out. We know there'll be impacts, but there's a lot that we can do to mitigate them and allow for growth in other areas. So a few of the key points that we looked at were: one, waste heat recovery. Data centers produce a lot of low-grade waste heat that can be used in many other applications. We looked at peak shaving, whereby during peak hours of the day and year, data centers can choose to curtail their electricity requirements and reduce system-level challenges. We also looked at district energy, a form of waste heat recovery where you can have very easy offloading of heat to other areas that might need it. And we also looked at power purchase agreements, whereby data centers can fund the construction of new low carbon or renewable electricity generation in the province. Moving over to 3 gigawatts. Now, this expansion is well above anything that the grid is able to handle in the next 10 years. So for this scenario, our focus shifts away from minimizing impacts to maintaining grid reliability first and foremost, and ensuring that we have sufficient energy availability for the province. This scenario relies heavily, therefore, on non-grid energy in order to make up the gap. We looked at natural gas in this case, along with large investments in renewable energy in the province as the most realistic and scalable solution for this kind of build-out. So let's dig into the numbers a little bit, starting off with 1.5 gigawatts of data center growth in the province by 2035. In blue, you can see the status quo. This is the impact of data centers currently on the province, and we're hovering around 2% of Ontario's total for all three metrics of interest: electrical energy consumption, coincident peak, and greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. Moving over to 2035, we can see that across the board, impacts have increased. The top number here, you can see right above the pink, that is what the impact would be without any mitigating solutions at all. But there's a lot that we can do in order to bring these numbers down. To get an idea of what this could look like, we looked at two specific case studies. The first case study looked at minimal adoption of mitigation solutions. So people are doing some things here and there, but there's a lack of coordination and maybe effort isn't as much as it could be. And in this case study, we can see already there is an incremental impact. We've reduced electrical energy consumption a little bit, and we've also reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Coincident peak, we're not doing quite as much there. Case study number 2 is a little bit more aggressive. So this looks at what would happen if there were much more widespread adoption of mitigation solutions, and this would probably require a lot more cross-party communication, so harder to do, but greater benefits. If we adopt a solution scenario closer to the second case study, we have much more significant reductions in specifically electrical energy consumption. So we're going down almost to where we are today. And greenhouse gas emissions also similarly show a very sharp decrease. Moving over to 3 gigawatts of data center growth. Now we can see that in this scenario, we have very different priorities and therefore very different impacts. Here the goal is to avoid overtaxing our grid and stabilizing the energy system. So let's walk through this chart. If it were possible for all data centers to plug into the grid, all 3 gigawatts, and the grid were able to support it, we'd be looking at data centers accounting for 15% of the province's electricity consumption, about 12% of Ontario's coincident peak, and about 15% of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation. You can see these numbers bolded in the figure here. Now, this isn't actually possible. There isn't enough electrical energy in the province to support this. And so in order to make 3 gigawatts of data center growth work, you need to have another energy source. And that's what we looked at in case study number 3. So we modeled what would happen if a full 50% of data centers in the province used behind the meter generation in order to get the energy they need to power their operation. And we said that that behind the meter generation would be primarily from natural gas. This is currently in the province the only short-term option for sourcing this amount of energy. Now, what this does to the impact of data centers on the province, you can see here. On electrical energy consumption, we go from about 15% of Ontario's total to 7.5%. So we half that. Similarly, we have the impacts on coincident peak, but those two things have another impact, a much more different impact on greenhouse gas emissions, which increase rather substantially from 15% to about 56% of Ontario's total greenhouse gas emissions from electricity. So this is a very large jump. But there is something that can be done in order to mitigate these impacts a little bit, and that's what we looked at in case study number 4, in which we combined this natural gas behind the meter generation with a very large build out of renewable electrical capacity. Now, we specifically looked at a build out of photovoltaic solar because we think that this can be very rapidly built out in the province at the lowest cost. And so doing so, we have mitigation of certain elements here. Looking at electrical energy consumption, we can actually see a very interesting phenomenon whereby data centers go from requiring about 15% of Ontario's total electricity to being net producers of electricity, being accountable for about 22% of the province's total generation. Now, this is because they would be funding a lot of renewable solar capacity, which would be able to increase the total amount available in the province. So this is great. It doesn't necessarily have a very large impact on coincident peak because solar generation tends to peak in the middle of the day, whereas peak demand is a little later in the day. And so without battery storage, it's a little challenging to have that capacity translate into coincident peak gains as well. And we do also have a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, going down from 56% to about 40%. Now, this is a substantial reduction. It isn't feasible to offset all natural gas emissions with low carbon electricity in Ontario alone. Our grid just isn't really big enough to allow for that. So in order to further offset greenhouse gas emissions from this build out, we need to look at solutions a little bit further afield. So that's about it from numbers. Based on our modeled scenarios and mitigating case studies, I'd also like to highlight some of the key recommendations that we came up with on a policy standpoint around the potential for pilot projects in the province and around creating a forum for ongoing collaboration. So looking at policy, there are a few things that really jumped out at us as being beneficial going forward. The first is prioritizing grid access for high value projects. So data centers considering perhaps plugging into a district energy system or co-locating with industrial activities should be given priority access into our market. Next, establishing requirements for mitigation readiness is very important. So data centers today should be considering how they can collect their waste heat, looking into peak shaving opportunities really before shovels hit the ground. The third point is enabling siting and coordination that's aligned with electricity system constraints. Simply put, just build where there's capacity. That makes it a lot easier for everyone involved. Four is applying screening mechanisms for large load applicants. Now, large loads can have very large impacts on near and medium-term grid planning, but they can also become anchor tenants for very large solutions. And so putting a focus on these projects is critical. We also want to create streamlined and coordinated permitting processes. We want to encourage the right projects and encourage collaboration between actors wherever we can. We'd also like to be able to fast track development pathways and targeted incentives. And finally, develop mechanisms for accountability and monitoring, because ultimately the public needs to see that these projects have value. We also talked a little bit about pilot projects. I can't go into many details, but workshop participants identified the value of pursuing co-located data center pilot development, designed and delivered through collaboration among multiple sectors, really with the goal of providing insights into the end-to-end development process and informing policy refinements. And finally, something that came up in all of our workshop discussions was the importance of having a forum for ongoing collaboration. And really the goal here is to support regular information exchange across multiple actors, to be able to update modeling and assumptions, best practices, identify emerging risks and opportunities, ensure consideration of economic, community impacts, affordability, environmental performance, and to produce research, guidance, design standards for the province and that can be used elsewhere as well. That's it from me. I will pass it back to Irene to facilitate the fireside chat. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Josh. We know there's a lot to dig into and discuss, and we do have limited time. So we encourage you to leave your questions in the Q&A function. I believe that's turned on, or you can send questions over to us. We will do our best to answer, but if not, we will make sure we follow up with you afterwards. Of course, you are also welcome to reach out to the project team with any questions you may have. One thing I did, of course, want to acknowledge leading into the fireside chat is that things are quickly evolving in this landscape. So much has changed from when we started the project about a year ago, and even from when we wrapped up in November, December. So what we wanted to capture in this fireside chat is a little bit about what has happened since and be able to bring that to light. So I think this is going to be a fun conversation, also because I get to ask both my current and former managers some tough questions, but I promise I will keep it professional and on topic. And of course, we'll keep it casual. So if there's anything you guys want to bring up, please feel free to do so. So I think you guys are both on screen now. So to kick us off, maybe in about 30 to 45 seconds, if you could tell us about your role in the ecosystem and what pulled you into this work, or perhaps what has been the most interesting about this work over the course of the last year. Kathleen, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I'm super excited to be here talking about the culmination of this year-long project in our home province. Really, really exciting. So I've been working in the data center space for about 5 years, and really my role at Mantle is to do a bunch of the COO things, but also lead our data center practice up to and including working with our data center clients on their sustainability efforts, both from a design and construction and operational perspective. And as well, I lead us in a few working groups, global working groups like the iMasons Climate Accord. I'm a vice chair of the Power Working Group there, so I get to have lots of great conversations on a weekly basis with others that are fighting this fight. But really, what originally drew me to it was this amazing, just sort of integration collision of what I love: clean tech, sustainability, tough business problems, tough physics problems, in really coming together in problems that you need to bring a lot of people together to try to solve together.
All right, well, I'll give it a shot next. I'm Tyler Hamilton. I'm Senior Director of Climate at MaRS. I've been at MaRS for 10 years, and my goal basically as leading the climate team at MaRS is to reduce barriers to the adoption of new innovations that can help to reduce impacts on the environment, on the climate. One of our programs, which Ria mentioned, which is our Better Buildings mission, is focused on doing that within the kind of built environment. And this just seemed like a natural research project for us to get involved with because this is one of the biggest issues right now. We're hearing all about it. Like Irene said, it's moving at a lightning pace. And we have a lot of companies in our network of 350 companies, startups that we work with that have solutions that could help to mitigate some of these impacts and allow us to be a little bit more strategic with our view for building data infrastructure in the province. So that's what's excited me about this project.
Amazing. Well, we'll dig into some more of the themes that you've introduced so far, but I think maybe to level set, there often are a lot of common misconceptions people have about data centers and sustainability to start. Kathleen, obviously you've got a deep perspective into what it's like to work with data centers and the sustainability work that we do. So maybe to start off, maybe if you could highlight what some of those misconceptions are, and perhaps what are some of the biggest gaps you're seeing in terms of what the general public's understanding or industry understanding of that work is.
Sure. It was thinking about this question. I was like, how do I narrow this down? Because it's just moving so quickly. It's hard for anyone to keep up. But bucketing it, I would say first and foremost, I think one of the misconceptions is that the data center industry is monolithic. It's actually quite nuanced, and it's not just a bunch of big hyperscalers. The hyperscaler means like the big cloud computing companies that build massive campuses and operate massive campuses, say the Googles and the Microsofts of the world. It's not just them running around building these giant campuses. There's many different business models, each of which influences the value proposition, the motivation, the balance sheet that the decision makers within those companies have to work with. And just a couple of examples, there's hyperscalers building for themselves and operating for themselves. They also lease big campuses. There's data center developers that start the design, the planning, the design, the construction, the operation, and when it's ready to go, they just lease those sites to some of the hyperscalers and others. There's other small ones, if anybody's familiar with the term co-location or colo. These are data center companies that build, own, and operate, but have many tenants, right? Many enterprise tenants, folks that just use their cloud computing. And so their profile and decision making is very, very different, as our balance sheets when thinking about sustainability, measurement, and disclosure, the amount of innovation they can bring to bear, the value of offsetting renewables. All of these things are impacted by that business case. So that's number one. Number two, this misconception, I think, that these major data center companies that have moved away from their sustainability objectives, which are notoriously ambitious and wonderfully so, really the most ambitious targets for positive climate outcomes in the world. And the reality is they have not moved away from them. What they've done is made it very hard on themselves to achieve them. But the types of innovations they're bringing to bear, the kind of conversations they're having to have, is breathtaking, but they are not moving away from their objectives. And you're seeing that manifest. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Third one, and I think this is a critical one when we think about it in our context, is that communities have no agency in this. I think communities have a tremendous amount of agency. I think we just need to bridge a bit of a knowledge gap. I think there needs to be a bit of a framework for how to engage with data center developers and understanding what they plan to bring, demand that it be transparent, but also be able to share what the community needs are, right? And I think what you'd find is that you're not as far apart as you thought you were. And last but not least, I want to throw this in because it's often brought up, but that workforce doesn't matter with these big, these data centers. Workforce matters dramatically. People say, you can go and build a bunch of training data centers in the middle of nowhere. Well, the reality is people don't actually really want to do that because you do need very, very highly skilled workforce, both for the design and construction at the beginning, the ongoing maintenance, because these things are never done, but also just it's the ongoing upgrades because these things are never done. And then of course the maintenance and security and all of the stuff. Workforce is a big deal. And I would say we probably locally don't have the workforce required for a potentially huge build out. So I'd leave it at that. And then I think what was the second piece was on bottlenecks.
Any biggest gaps or if where are you seeing the most momentum, if there are any particular bottlenecks that you see constantly reoccur?
Well, the bottleneck really is physics, which, Josh kind of went through earlier. We are running up against the limits of physics with this stuff. And we'll get into what that means in the Canadian/Ontario/GTHA context and shortly. But the momentum is really on the energy innovation side. It's energy and water. I will say there's a tremendous amount of water innovation going on as well. So resource consumption, the pace of innovation and the money being thrown at it, the investment being thrown at it is unlike anything I've seen. So
it's
that part's very exciting.
Definitely exciting time. There's a lot of areas to kind of go down on tangents, but I think the big focus of our study was really around energy. So we often do frame the problem as protecting the grid or building digital infrastructure. At least that's, often what we see in articles and headlines. I think in our project, we really try to tackle both. So for both of you, and Tyler, maybe if you want to start, why is it important that we're treating these in the same conversation? What does this mean for both maybe the short term and longer term, just because our scope was only 10 years, so we don't really paint the full picture for everybody who is not deeply in the study with us.
Yeah, I think the reason why we keep them in the same conversation is we shouldn't be viewing data centers as like parasitic on the grid. It's actually a grid asset, and how we design them can make them more valuable as part of that. And depending on the approach you take, like if it's existing data centers or ones that are newly being built today, there are some smaller things that you can do that are quicker things to reduce the impact. We're going to talk about some of those solutions and later on in this fireside. But then there's others that you really have to put the pieces in place early. So the question over the kind of short term versus long term, which I think you're going to get at through this question. If we want to basically start putting in the policies and incentives in place today to get the kind of data centers we want in our communities over the long term. So that's like flexible, grid-friendly data centers that don't increase the difficulty of managing supply and demand on the grid, but actually make it easier to manage. ones that create high value jobs and are significantly contributing to Canada's economic goals. Um, if you start thinking about how we can really do that deep mitigation and really kind of maximize how data centers integrate with the grid over the long term, it's going to require uh, and this is both through construction and operation. It's going to require planning and coordination with multiple community stakeholders. Right? This gets complicated. This is very tricky. And this is why one of our recommendations was to create a forum for these discussions, because like these aren't just this is just not a one-off report that here's a report, read it. Like these things need to continue. And what we did experience in these workshops that we did is everybody was just happy. We were all kind of getting together in the same room talking about it because everybody's kind of analyzing these things in isolation. And I think the key is to just create some kind of structure through which we can set the goals and then create a roadmap to get there. Finally, again, we'll be talking about some of the innovations that we're talking about, but I just want to compare it to Europe to North America. Like, if you think of some of the examples that were mentioned, like integrating data centers into, say, district heating or district energy systems, like this is happening already today in Europe because they have existing infrastructure that data centers more easily plug into. And the reason why they plug into that is because they get social license. It's easier to get the community buy-in. We're starting to see a lot more pushback in North America from communities because they're starting to realize the impacts these large pieces of infrastructure have on the grid and have on the community. So I think we really have to start thinking about, like, it's going to take longer to get there, but how we kind of treat this more as an urban planning exercise. Because ultimately, I think to get these things built, you're going to need to get that social license from communities. Otherwise, time is the enemy here. Speed is the name of the game. And if you're getting like pushback from the communities, you're not going to get these things built in the time you need them.
I agree with everything, Tyler. And I also, just at the heart of the question, I don't think we need to explain why we need to protect the grid, but why in addition to the digital infrastructure. And I think, there's not going to be any major scientific innovation, startup breakthroughs from here on out that don't rely on heavy advanced compute. Canada needs to have a car on the train, not be a deer on the track. And I think we've seen that we need access to compute, advanced compute that we can control, that we have access to no matter what. So that's a part of it. The other part is these are economic engines. It's coming. And the short-term part of it is pretty dramatic. I was listening to a webinar. I was watching a webinar by Uptime Institute a couple weeks ago. They have great intel. And it was focused in on the Wisconsin and Illinois market. And there's a big pocket of development going on there. And it's in the tens of gigawatts, right? Tens of gigawatts. It started as one big Microsoft training center, and then they started to get some concentration. Then they realized this is a great place for inference. I don't know if anybody caught NVIDIA's big conference last week, but the name of the game now is the models are good enough to really start to use. And so now people are building as close to cities as possible. So this development that you're seeing around the greater Chicago, Milwaukee area is coming to a city near you. And that's true of Toronto. So this world of inference being around the GTHA is coming, and it's less than 10 years away. That's why we need a short-term and a long-term strategy. I think longer term is really exciting, right? We've got lots of natural resources that lead to clean energy that we can bring to bear. We've got a re-emerging nuclear supply chain. We've got that gives us time for transmission connected renewables, all kinds of really great things. The short term is exactly what Tyler said. We need to innovate in a big way. We need to do it yesterday. We need to do it together. And it needs to be paired with the developments we already have planned, because we have a lot of plans for a lot of homes over the next 10 years as well, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation there.
I mean, when you mentioned the Chicago or Illinois example, we're talking about tens of gigs. We're only, in our study, we only looked at 1.5 or 3 gigs, and that already is quite challenging based off of our results. So kind of tying back to saying the next 10 years is difficult, what might be the most challenging aspects of those next 10 years, and what are things we can put in place to maybe enable us to have kind of more ease in the 10 years after, when all of these other things are available to us.
Well, if we knew the answer to that question, we'd be doing something different. No, I think it comes down to balancing, again, really understanding as a group. So it's energy providers, it's the communities, it's the policymakers, it's the developers, it's the researchers, right? We cannot forget, like, we have real use cases here. We cannot lose our researchers to other countries because we don't have access to advanced compute. So it's everybody coming together and saying, like, what do we need? What do we need, right? What do we need for our base case? What's gravy? How do we pair it with, and we have some massive urban redevelopment projects going on in the GTHA that all require hundreds of megawatts just for themselves, right? A lot of that for space heating. How do we pair this so that you only have to, burn whatever it is once and then get compute and the heat, right? So it really will require continued collaboration. And I do think there's an appetite, by the way, from these big data center companies. They want to be a part of this. They actually really do have strong governance internally on carbon emissions, and they are willing to come to the table and talk about how to do that.
Yeah, I would just add that, we had this discussion in one of the workshops, like, is this similar to mining where like companies will only plan to be in a community for a short period of time, but data centers are here to stay, right? Like once they get built, they're not going anywhere. This is just going to continue to grow and grow and grow. So it's worth their time to invest in the communities that they're going to be in indefinitely. Versus like mining company that sets up shop with the intention of like, economically injecting jobs and economic activity into a town, and then they pick up and go 20 years later when the mine is depleted. So it's important to take that long-term view, and I think more and more of the developers are realizing that.
For sure, a lot of the clients we work with at Mantle have that same view. It's also a better business model for them to be able to have that view so that they're not constantly swapping in and out, and that they're building the right workforce so that they can continue to do this work, especially at the speed and pace that they're building right now. So perhaps this is a good segue into just looking at what data centers are already doing that's meaningful today when it comes to sustainability, and maybe what are those opportunities to tie that into some of the things we're trying to do in the next 10 years, or things to mitigate against some of the challenges we've set for the next 10 years.
Sure. Well, I think most folks are aware that from a sustainability perspective, actually, maybe not so aware of the internal governance structures of sustainability within some of these companies. But certainly some of the output that many of them are some of the largest buyers of renewable energy, and have been for, a good decade. But going further, really diving into, I don't know if the GHG protocol is getting an update. They're at the table. They're talking about moving beyond annual renewable energy matching to having to do it on the hour. So making sure that whatever load they use in an hour can be offset by low emission, non-emitting resources within that hour. Really, really, really hard to do. But they are building out the governance, and some of them already do this. So really driving innovation in that space. You're seeing all kinds of announcements on restarting, nuclear plants or refurbishing them for continued use. You're seeing a lot of interest in and offtake agreements already being signed in PPA terms for new nuclear. I think last week or a few weeks ago now, I think one of them had their biggest the biggest investment to date in long duration energy storage on a megawatt hour basis. For a site, I believe, in Michigan. And so you're just seeing, carbon capture and storage from natural gas generation. So if you're using natural gas on site, being able to capture and store it doesn't work everywhere, obviously, but you're just seeing these types of energy innovation that without this necessity never would have happened. And I'm of a mind, Tyler, and you and I have talked about this, I'm of a mind that, electrifying space heating, electrifying transportation, and electrifying industry was going to be hard enough. We needed to build, invest in our grid to be a 21st century clean grid. This had to happen anyway. This data center investment wave, I look at it as an opportunity to underwrite a lot of the investments we had to make anyway.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind too, just quickly that we talk about it's slow to connect to the grid, they're moving to natural gas, but there's challenges with the natural gas supply chain as well, right? Like there's like long waiting lists to get turbines. There's natural gas itself is harder to get to the location these days because there's queues waiting to get connected. I'll talk about it in the next question, but like, we're seeing a lot of inefficient natural gas generator sets being deployed that are really bad for the environment as a kind of stopgap. And the challenge is to not have those things become permanent. Like hopefully these developers are planning to only have them as temporary fixes, but some of the things that they're doing to just get these things built in a fast way are quite alarming, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that that's kind of some of the trade-offs we've been looking at is the balance of a long-term build, but maybe there are some things that need to be done in the near term to get us to be able to
Mhm.
be positioned for some of those kind of long-term visions that we have.
Yeah.
Um, Speaking about innovation, Tyler, what role can the innovation ecosystem play? Obviously, we talked a little bit about the technologies, and a lot of these are already technologies that exist and being deployed. We didn't quite get to maybe some of the more emerging technologies in the 10-year scope. So maybe if you could
Yeah.
cover some of those and perhaps even beyond technology, what else is happening?
Yeah, like I said, some of it is like I could group it into two buckets. Those that can kind of be deployed or considered today in an existing data center, an existing operational environment, or integrated into a new build today. So these are things like technologies for capturing the waste heat. There's more and more liquid immersion data centers. There's a lot of like that, the heat of that liquid is there and can be captured. There's technologies for converting it into electricity and feeding it back into either the grid or back into the data center so that it offsets the electricity load. There's emerging technologies for converting that heating directly into cooling to offset the cooling load. We're seeing companies, and all these examples are companies that we're working with today. We're seeing companies that are extracting water from fog. It sounds crazy, and it'll only work in certain environments. But data centers are testing this stuff out. We are seeing technologies or approaches such as building data centers with DC wiring throughout because the conversion from AC to DC does introduce a lot of inefficiencies. And if you can go DC all the way, that can reduce up to 10% of your energy use. So these are the things that can be considered today. Longer term, when you're starting to think about, do we want to integrate geothermal networks and storage into these systems? When I say geothermal, I mean more of the HVAC type versus the deep geothermal for power generation. That said, in the US, there's a lot of projects for power generation through geothermal that are being contracted to support data center growth. Um, it, you know, the other obvious thing that we can consider today and will be more important in the future is energy storage, right? Like we can procure a lot of solar, we can procure wind, we can procure some of this intermittent renewable resources, but you're going to need either natural gas or energy storage to help kind of keep it balanced. And we're working with companies that are doing long duration energy storage that could be perfect for this company in Mississauga called eZinc. Um, and I think that's increasingly going to be essential and built and become like table stakes for just building data centers in the future. And let's not forget AI. Like these data centers are being built for AI applications. AI itself is going to help with this data center infrastructure by bringing intelligence in that helps to manage the loads. There's even talk of leveraging AI and energy management software to help companies build smaller data centers closer to grid access points and then network them together so that they're kind of behaving like a single hyperscaler. So you don't have to, you know, build this monolithic gigawatt type data center, but you can break them into smaller chunks. And the last thing I'll mention is that one of the companies we work with, Arca Climate, they're a carbon dioxide removal mineralization play. They recently got an order from Microsoft for 300,000 tons of durable CDR credits over the next 10 years. And that's an example of Microsoft. Like if they're leveraging natural gas for their data centers because they need to get them built, they're on the back end buying these credits because they want to offset that impact over that short 10-year time frame. So these are all of the different things that are kind of in the mix that developers are considering. And if they're not considering, they should.
Kathleen, I know you're probably seeing a lot of other innovations, maybe outside of the Canadian ecosystem. Any others to add to Tyler's list?
Well, I think we've named a lot of them. I actually would love to focus a little bit more on what we can do here because it's funny. Everybody talks about collaboration, 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 and all the the conferences I go to. I was just at a conference this week where the title of the panel was something I can't remember exactly what it was, but the idea of it was energy providers need to collaborate with developers who need to collaborate with X, Y, and Z. And the only people on the call were data center developers. And so it was like we say to collaborate, but it's often not really happening. And what I love about this project and what where the next steps might lead is that we do, right? We have the right group talking, building a common language, starting to understand each other's needs, wants. And we have that opportunity. But to put it in perspective, I mentioned the Wisconsin, Chicago area numbers. To put it in perspective from our good friends at CBRE and Cushman Wakefield, I think we have roughly 350 megawatts of operating IT in the GTHA as we speak. 350 megawatts, right? It's not a lot. And if Ontario, if Canada is serious about having, sovereign compute for both economic development and security reasons, and we want, self-driving, and we want these other, all of this other stuff, that's going to increase dramatically. And you look around, it's painful to see, but it's true. This is on the back of natural gas in the short term. The physics block we've really come up against is 24/7 demand doesn't match up well with the current way that data centers have been developing renewable power, right? That's not firm. They need firm power yesterday, and the paradigm is broken the way we've built the grid. And if we think that we can solve it by continuing to do the same things we've always done, we're just not going to get there. So I think it's really important. I was talking to a colleague that I work with who's developing a big one over in the Nordics, and they're setting it up for waste heat recovery, but they don't have a heat off taker yet. That's the biggest problem, right? And that type of collaboration has to happen early, and it's hard. We have that opportunity here. We can start now with that collaboration and start with the heat off taker, who, by the way, we have a really big natural gas load for heat as we speak, right? Even if we have to double the grid, maybe double the grid, or 65, 75, whatever percent it is by 2050, we're still burning, even in that scenario, we're still burning a lot of natural gas to heat our homes and our spaces. There's a lot of innovation in there to have it work out for everybody, where we get, double the productivity for the same amount of emissions. So anyway, yeah, I'll leave it at that, but I think the opportunity here is massive.
I would totally echo that. And just one mention of one of the workshop participants. It was a venture that we invited. Just as an example, like they've got an approach to drilling shallow geothermal wells, but in a horizontal way. So you could go underneath an existing data center after the data center is built and put in a thermal storage network there that could operate in isolation of even a community, but could be there for when the community kind of grows around it and could connect at some point. So this is the kind of long-term thinking, but the innovations are starting to emerge that will allow us to think that way. Whereas before it was like, if you didn't build the geothermal and integrate it at the very beginning, you'd be SOL. So it's exciting to see a lot of these innovations coming together. And my goal at MaRS is just to make sure that those innovators are talking to the developers. And by the way, some of those developers do stand out. Like Kathleen said, they're not a monolithic group. There are some out there that they're just focused. This is part of their plan. Their mission is to kind of push the limits on what you can do with data center design. We're seeing a lot of it in Europe, but there's some in the US is also emerging. So it's very encouraging.
Yeah, there's so much exciting things happening. And again, working in innovation, having worked in innovation, I think this is a very exciting place to be. We're just coming to time. So maybe for one last question, Kathleen, you've already kind of said we not to pat ourselves on the back, but we've done a good job of bringing together these different groups and setting ourselves up for more of that collaborative conversation. But obviously, we don't want our report to just sit on a shelf. So if we really want to move fast and innovate, like we've talked about in this conversation, what can that actually look like? What are some ideas that you're thinking of to move this forward?
Yeah, I mean, success is that we are doing the deep investment level feasibility modeling on a co-located data center here in the GTHA that will be a community resource, not just from an energy perspective, but from an economic perspective, and also that will provide compute to the people that need it the most right now in Canada, which is our scientists, our researchers. I think we can pair all of those things, pair them all together. But really, to get there over the next little bit, we want to keep going, we want to keep having the conversation, and we want to solve the problems that need to be solved between now and that moment. There's a lot of other avenues to take, and we need lots of people to jump on. But that's certainly one that we're keenly excited about. At Mantle, we are a sustainability firm, and we need to stay very close to where we feel like we can add value, which is really on that side of things of like, if this is going to be needed, how do we do this as well as possible from an energy and carbon perspective? And so that's a really good spot for us to kind of drive progress, is bringing people together to say, what could a real project in Toronto look like?
Tyler, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that, we have a lot of public land. I think there's a huge opportunity for the sandbox, which is one of the recommendations we have, to be able to kind of build a world-class data center that has minimal impacts on the grid or reduced as much as possible. Um, it needs cooperation across municipal, provincial, federal levels, but the space is there, right? Waterfront Toronto. We're talking about building nuclear at Wesleyville, which is just like a big field that has like the ultimate transmission access. Like we could start thinking about utilizing and co-locating data centers where it strategically makes sense in the GTHA or just outside of our boundaries. So I would encourage government and developers and innovators to get together and start talking about that scenario.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, we are coming up to time, so I'm going to thank Tyler and Kathleen for this conversation. This is just the beginning. Obviously, this is kind of the first step in a lot of exciting work to come. So I look forward to continuing that with the Mantle team as well as the MaRS team. And again, for those that we didn't get to the questions of, we will follow up with you offline. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions. But with that, I will pass it back to Ria to close us out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. What a great conversation. So thank you, Tyler and Kathleen, for your expertise. Thank you, Irene, for your very skillful moderation. We had a couple of anonymous questions come through the chat. So if you are the author of one of those anonymous questions, if you want to just send us your contact info so we can follow up with you appropriately. And then we also have our contact email on the screen for you to take a look at. And reach out if you need to. So with that, I want to just quickly recap a couple of the key things that I heard. First of all, there's a role here for everyone. Our panelists really highlighted the importance of collaboration and being part of the conversation. And just it was also so exciting to hear about some of the immense value that could be brought by including innovation as part of this conversation. Also encouraging to hear about the sort of long-term view of development that folks are taking and the importance of doing that and the role that sustainability and climate continues to play in these conversations. So once again, thank you so much for that conversation. And thank you to you all for joining us. We have a really quick event survey in the chat, which we would appreciate if you would be willing to share your feedback. It'll take less than a minute and help us improve for future events. As mentioned prior, the recording for this will be available on the missionformars.ca website. And with that, just want to thank you all and wish you all a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.